you both y'all for taking the time to attend, as well as Jothis for his continued support and encouragement throughout the progression of this presentation. Let's go ahead and get started. Idealizing the Revolutionary, Understanding the Domination of Personhood in Ideal Theory. The first question that's perhaps already started to creep into the back of your mind is, why revolution? What's the purpose of viewing the social contract through this lens instead of another? The truth is it's twofold. One of these points will become clearer closer to the end of this presentation, while the other is, in a sense, a more pragmatic one. Currently, we're in a time of unprecedented unrest, not only in the US, but across the globe. Whether you're on either side of the aisle, dissatisfaction with government has begun to reach a tipping point. Cambridge University performed a study in the US over 25 years, with satisfaction in democracy dropping from 75% of Americans in 1995 to less than 50% as of 2020. And we can only see this going on a global scale just as much. If ever a time was more ripe for some sort of revolution, whether it be societal or political, it would be now. With that in mind, my aim is to try to better understand these events, not simply historically, but theoretically through the tools provided to us by social contract theory. Leading us into the main meat of our presentation, let's begin with an introduction to John Rawls' conception of the social contract, with ultimately an explicit interest in his notion of ideal theory. But before jumping ahead to Rawls' principles, what is the social contract? It's often referred to as an agreement, or contract, formed by people for the purposes of establishing a government that protects and maintains their social order. There's a trade-off, though, as by agreeing to submit to this new authority, one is forced to give up certain freedoms as afforded to them by lawlessness. But in the end, they're given a set of rights that are meant to protect them in their newly formed government. A pretty easy example of this is our own Constitution, its set of rules and regulations that form the basis of our government and its powers, as well as offering us a set of rights that are unable to be infringed upon. One major difference, though, is that our social contract theory doesn't necessarily have to be an explicit one. Sometimes that consent is given more tacitly through our behavior. Whether it be following the laws or participating in politics, either through voting or activism, we've accepted the overall social order, even if we may have problems with specific parts, without signing a single document. That begs the question, though, what would lead individuals to agree to give up to their freedoms for the establishment of a political order? From there, we move on to the second part of social contract theory, the state of nature. The state of nature is an analysis of what life would be like prior to the political. In this life, humans are bound only by their own strength and morals, with perhaps the caveat of small family units. Almost every social contract theorist has their own thoughts on the state of nature, with each of them providing a separate account of why that voluntary consent takes place. But in the end, what unifies all of these ideas is that through reason, each of these people favor the legitimization of this government through the social contract. Rawls' conception of the social contract, or Rawls' conception of the state of nature, is certainly the most unique, and complicated, though. Instead of a pseudo-anthropological account, Rawls draws upon Kant's principle of a person's capacity to reason from a universal standpoint, which provides them the ability to judge principles from an impartial perspective, ultimately allowing them to derive both moral and political views from that impartiality. With that in mind, Rawls then proposes us to think about which principles we would use when forming our basic society, but with the big caveat of our inability to know ahead of time the role we take up in that society. Or using his terms, a veil of ignorance is placed upon you. No one in this veil of ignorance is supposed to have any idea of either their ethnicity, social status, gender, and importantly for Rawls, their conception of the good. Rawls believes that by doing this, participants are forced to think impartially, with a heavy reliance on reason for determining basic principles that will best support them without any knowledge of who they're to be. From there, Rawls begins to develop what he believes to be the main thesis of his theory of justice, something he calls justice as fairness. He breaks it down into two primary principles, beginning with that protection of rights as a part of all social contracts, as we mentioned earlier, as well as including the ability to hold public office and positions, not just technically but conceivably. And then his second principle, composed of two components, something called the fair equality of opportunity and the difference principle. The fair equality of opportunity is similar to his defense of the ability for citizens to hold public office, but with things outside the political. Essentially the notion that citizens with the same talents and willingness to use them should have the same educational and economic opportunities regardless of whether they were born rich or poor. He repeatedly points out that people who are born in these positions of power have done so entirely by chance, and no special opportunity should be afforded to them simply because of that. This directly leads into a second component, the difference principle. Rawls, still looking out for the rights and liberties afforded to us in the first principle, decides that some inequality is ultimately inevitable due to the different interests and benefit and abilities of others. But so long as it's to the benefit of everyone, specifically the worst off, it's allowed in our society. Finally, we approach Mill's critique of Rawls. While he wasn't entirely opposed to the idea of justice and fairness, he had significant problems with the underlying assumptions of that conclusion, and specifically with his approach to ideal theory in general. Mills approached his critique from the perspective of race. Specifically, he highlighted Rawls' inability to properly theorize about racial inequality. While the focus was race, Mills didn't believe this was the only dimension that was exploited by ideal theory. He, with the help of Carol Pateman, developed the domination contract as the intersection of all these dimensions: gender, race, class, sexuality, ability, etc. For our purposes, we shall primarily focus on Mill's critique while borrowing some of the larger implications from this wider work. Beginning with one of Mill's biggest critiques of ideal theory, he exposes the inability for Rawls' theory to apply to any government ever formed. Rawls admits this as much in his own work, describing it as a thought experiment more meant to understand the ideal form of justice normatively as what we should be trying to achieve in government. He developed it even further by setting the assumption in his theory of a world where no colonialism, slavery, or even racial inequality has existed. He concedes that in this position, race has essentially been entirely abstracted out. Mills illustrates some of the major incongruencies in this argument, though. He exposes by this almost colorblind account of justice, we're essentially excluding conversations on race from context. We're unable to have discussions about reparations or even affirmative action, as our ideal justice cannot give us a normative model to achieve, as was Rawls's goal. Mills continues his critique, exposing that throughout history, it's actually been more shown that these governments themselves are more often the ones perpetuating this inequality even further, instead of reducing it as proposed by Rawls. He exposes this by how the confluence of rights and liberties throughout history were more often afforded to those who were already held that dominant power. Whether it be explicit through things like slavery and segregation, or implicit such as voter discrimination and racial profiling, it's obvious that those who are excluded are considered people in the same way as those afforded rights. These rights then help legitimate the structures already being put into place, as dominant peoples are both the ones in charge and the ones afforded the most liberty. Rawls ultimately has a positive takeaway, though. Instead of simply throwing out Rawls' conception of justice and fairness completely, he proposes the domination contract as a valuable tool to investigate something he calls non-ideal positions. Rawls discusses these ideas briefly in his own work, but dismisses it, saying that ideal theory provides a more systematic grasp of the more pressing problems. Mill sees this assumption as not only inaccurate, as mentioned earlier, but also highly damaging to Rawls' ultimate thesis due to that faultiness. No longer is the social contract an egalitarian defense of rights and liberty, but an atomization of a specific type of individual to the exclusion of the rest. In the end, perpetuating a logic that legitimizes governmental action that continues the exclusion for those dominant persons unable to even recognize the failure. By incorporating Mill's theory of domination contract, we're able to rid ourselves of most of these assumptions, not only because of their accuracy, but its ability to recognize the contextual nature of justice. Returning to revolution, my interest in them, as mentioned earlier, has started to become more apparent as we finally reach our discussion on non-ideal theory. By analyzing these realities through our domination contract, we conceive of a contextual justice that aims to alleviate the concerns of the currently dominated. Specifically, it allows us to identify those people who, during the fighting and formation of government, were ultimately excluded from that original conception of full personhood during those early years. Beginning with India, while it has never experienced a full-scale, successful militant revolution against British imperialism, it did eventually experience a large enough cultural revolution, as from the beginning with the rebellion of 1857 all the way to the announcement of the Indian Independence Act of 1947. During this period, plenty of both violent and nonviolent strikes were occurring all throughout the country, with calls for an independent India only rising with more time. B.R. Ambedkar, an Indian reformist, points out in his book Annihilation of Caste that oftentimes the primary purveyors of these actions were less progressive reformist revolutionaries, but more often played to reactionary nationalistic impulses. One of the largest reasons for the rebellion of 1857 was the prevention of British attempts to rid India of its hierarchical caste structure. The rebellion was almost entirely composed of upper caste members. Even by 1947, while British government primarily decolonized due to World War II, the Indian independence movement had only continued through these years due to various nationalistic groups rising up in opposition to British rule. Ambedkar argues that this is one of the largest reasons why, despite his best efforts to rid the hierarchical caste system during the drafting of the Indian Constitution, support for codifying his action into law was entirely opposed. The Haitian Revolution, unlike India, was entirely a militant one in response to continued French colonial rule. As the first successful slave rebellion to establish a European-modeled state in the Western Hemisphere, it might be hard to understand how such an event could find ways of domination and exclusion. But when we realize the composition of leadership during this time, the picture begins to become more clear. While it's true that Haitian Revolution was primarily bottom-up, with most of its supporters being slaves or freedmen still being discriminated against by colonial rule, most of the generals and leadership were entirely composed of mulattoes, the half-Asian, half-French children of mostly white plantation owners, and either slaves or freedwomen of color. and held a place in society above even the freedmen due to their more often higher education, even owning their own plantations and slaves. This, of course, led to initial distrust and outright conflict among rebelling slaves during the early part of the rebellion. Their initial incorporation into the rebellion as fellow revolutionaries legitimized their role in the newly forming society. It's unsurprising that how post-revolution politics ended up eventually turning out, with the majority of white people gone, mulattoes due to their higher education and majority of landowning became the elite of Haitian society. The eventual Republic of Haiti was led by a mulatto, Jean-Pierre Boyer. Mulatto domination of politics, economics, and urban life after the revolution created a different kind of two-caste society, as most Haitians were rural subsistence farmers, the mulatto elite who continued to rule Haiti while the formidable Haitian army kept them in power. Ultimately, drawing upon these non-ideal positions, we see the relationship between authority and personhood, specifically how by excluding certain individuals from either full economic or political personhood during the development of government, the elite can continue to legitimize their continued authority, oftentimes in quite reactionary ways. By using Mill's domination contract, we can not only identify these failures in justice, but which groups have been dominated, whether it be the lower castes of India or fully black freedmen of Haiti, while still maintaining our final thesis of brawls in support of justice and fairness due to these inequalities. Thanks for listening. I hope you have a good day.